Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agri. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, I'm talking to Agri's Ian Rudge, Conservation and Regen Agriculture Lead, Agri's agronomist, John Vickery, and Tom Martin, who farms near Peterborough. Today, we're going to look at regen agriculture, looking at the key benefits of improving soil structure and how this can make a significant impact on farm sustainability. So, good morning to you all.
Yes.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Tony.
Good morning, and it's fantastic to have you all here on Tramlines. And for you, John, and for you, Tom, welcome back to another episode that you're featuring on. So let's start with that big question: what is regen agriculture? And maybe, Ian, we could start with you. What is regen agriculture for you?
Tony, regen agriculture for me is, in the first instance, it's understand your farm operations. So it's the owner, land manager. I think what they particularly want, obviously you've got to minimise your soil disturbance, maximise your crop diversity, and keep your soil covered, and maintain living roots all year round, and in many instances integrate livestock where you can into the process.
And for you, John, as an agronomist, you cover quite a wide breadth of farms and soil types. What is regen agriculture for you?
Yep, very similar. I think, key areas are those soil structures and soil cover items that Ian mentioned. The livestock is the icing on the cake, really, whereby we're able to cycle nutrients much faster and bring in some different dynamics to the farming environment. So that's what I see as Tony.
Yeah, and Tom, you're farming on, I assume, and I think from talking before, some pretty heavy land up there at Peterborough. What is regen for you?
Well, obviously, we covered the kind of 5 pillars of regen ag in the last podcast. But I was mulling recently, and I realised that we'd never set out to be regenerative agriculture farmers, but actually we'd adopted those 5 pillars independently because they all individually made sense, and of course collectively they're even greater as well. But I think for me as a farmer, there's a financial decision to it. But there's also it's a feeling as well. I've really enjoyed my farming as a regenerative farmer. I think more than I had before. So it's a financial thing, and it's a feeling as well.
Yeah, very interesting. And actually, in some of the other podcasts, talking to Marek Nowakowski about the hungry gap and birds and the bees, etc., he talks a lot about farmers enjoying this way of farming. There's a real pride and an enjoyment when out there walking the land. So a great thing to keep and remember, I think. Now, the financial side, Ian, you also mentioned this, that there is a financial benefit of regen agriculture. Tell us where that stems from. How does regen agriculture allow the financial benefits to happen?
Well, I mean, as you know, Tony, the last few years, fuel prices have crept up, and particularly very much more recently, all the inputs in terms of nitrogen and other nutrients and ag chems, everything is increasing in cost to the farmer. So the considerations of your cultivation processes, recreational cultivation is something that has to be considered as being sort of obsolete, but everything has to point to good soil structure. If your soil structure isn't in a good heart, remedial works have to be done to get that into a position that it can have reduced tillage or no tillage. Look at how you can improve your soil structure by improving your soil organic matter, and the whole process really still has to make a good margin at the end of the day, or else farming, what are you farming for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, farm sustainability financially is absolutely critical, isn't it? Tom, you've also talked about the benefits in terms of soil structure. What have you noticed that's changed over the last few years since you've been adopting this regen approach?
Well, going back to my kind of point on the finances and the feelings, obviously we've noticed a reduction in our cost of establishment in particular, which is a great financial boost. But on the feeling side of things, the trafficability of the land is just remarkable. Both my father and I have noticed, in a relatively short period of time, the difference that the regenerative approach has made. As I say, we're on quite heavy clay, and so that would really put the fields out of bounds for a tractor for probably 4 months of the year. And yet now, in relatively short time, with soil health improving, the soil structure being better, and actually more able to carry traffic, we can get on with field operations, spraying and drilling it and such, at a greater range of times. And whilst it's not all about just getting heavy machinery on the land, in fact, far from it, it does mean that we have more options on the farming side of things.
Yeah, and when you talk about a relatively short period of time, give us a clue. I mean, in terms of years, how long are we talking here? Between you adopting some of these techniques and seeing some of the benefit.
Well, we moved from full inversion tillage to minimum tillage about 30 years ago, but actually the big difference has been in the last 5 years when we moved to no-till, and we've really seen the difference in that shorter period of time.
Yeah, and 5 years in farming, I mean, that's 5 crops. It's not a huge period of time, is it? John, coming to you, you, I know, advise as an agronomist on a wide range of soil types. Are you seeing that improvement on some of the other soil types away from the clays?
Yes, I am, Tony, and I'd reiterate what Tom has said on the heavy soils, but also on some of the lighter Cotswold brush soils that I work on. I see the benefits in terms of water holding capacity and soil buffering from that point of view. So almost the opposite, where we're seeing better drainage and better trafficability on the heavier land. We're also seeing better water holding capacity and fields being able to sustain crops for slightly longer in periods of dry weather, which we seem to be getting these days with sort of longer periods of sort of dry or wet. So much more resilient to those extremes.
Yeah, and indeed we've seen that prolonged dry period again this spring, haven't we? Ian, as technical lead for Agri in this area, what is actually happening in terms of this change in soil structure by moving to this minimum tillage, this different way of looking after the soil? What's actually changing that allows this better trafficability, as Tom talks about? What's actually happening?
Well, Tony, the government paper on climate change was stating that we were going to get more rain events over 30 millimetres. That was going to increase by 70%. And conversely, the periods of drought. And I think we've seen that with 2 particularly wet autumns in 2019 and 2020. The autumn of 21 was more atypical. But we've been seeing some very dry springs as a result, and also therefore soil structure and soil resilience. So being able to get good water infiltration in the periods of wet, as Tom has just stated, having both good soil structure, improving soil organic matter. So organic matter can hold up to 20 times more water than soil alone. So maintaining the moisture within your soil profile can help improve the resilience of the crop going forward in periods of drought, as we've seen this year, Tony.
Yeah, and that crop resilience is clearly a huge benefit, isn't it? Tom, just coming back to you, you mentioned that you've been able to reduce the use of artificial fertilizers, and you've seen that benefit rise over the last, as you said, 5 years. So tell us a bit about that, because that's hugely relevant right now, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think if we can all generate the same or greater profit, but with a far lower working capital, i.e. lower inputs, then we'd all be winners. And this situation at the moment has only served to highlight that. We've probably reduced our artificial fertilizer by about a third and over the last 4 years. And then this year, we're probably at about, between a half and 60% of what we typically apply. We are using some biological nitrogen fixers as well as part of that, which is not necessarily on the regen side of things, but it's very much in the spirit of regen. But it does just mean that we can reduce our input costs get the soil working, get the soil ecosystem really performing, and so far the crops are looking good this year. Mind you, I think everyone's crops are looking pretty good this year. It's not been a bad year for it. So, but as ever, we'll wait and see what the combine says in the summer.
So, in 5 years, the benefits are absolutely huge, is what I'm hearing. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I think a great case study is my father, who was willing at the beginning of our regenerative journey 5 years ago, but has probably moved from compliant to an absolute out and out evangelist in that period of time, such that, you know, and actually it's very clear to see. We had a neighbour walk across our field just in the very wet winter of 2019 to 2020, and that was enough for him to say, gosh, I need to start doing some of this ourselves as well. And whilst we don't always get it right, we've made plenty of mistakes, but we've learned from each one of those, and we're getting better each year.
Yeah, sure. So John, coming to you, is there also a willingness to try out some of these regen techniques to be able to see some of these benefits?
Oh, certainly, Tony. Yes, people, it's a sort of evolution rather than revolution, and people are, as they often do, looking over the hedge, as Tom has said there, at what the neighbours are doing and learning off each other. I think where there are techniques that suit certain soil types or things that are working well, the exchange of that knowledge is vital. And certain things will work on certain farms and maybe not on others, but certainly we've seen a wider uptake of the sort of techniques that we're using, lower disturbance drills, and the addition of organic amendments, and in some cases the return of some stock on some farms that maybe haven't seen stock for many decades.
And so, Ian, for the farmer that's thinking about, okay, so what next? What would be your top tips in terms of where to start, or how to take the next step in terms of what you're already doing? Tom's talked about trying things out. Sometimes it doesn't always work. So I'm thinking about that farmer who's maybe thinking, yeah, but okay, I've started to move away from full inversion cultivation, but how do we keep moving forward?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of information out there, Tony. I mean, obviously, groundswell's coming up fairly soon. I think there's an awful lot of forums on which people can gain information. And obviously, I think, as Tom has said, neighbours look over and watch what other neighbours are doing and can take good heart and information from seeing what other people are doing. Also, in reality, there is degrees by which you sort of can move from a very conventional system into a reduced system. And in reality, it is down to basically a thought process within the landowner's mind or manager's mind, and it is a will to make something succeed. And trial and error is part of that whole process, to be fair, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, are you seeing the same?
Yes, absolutely, we are. I think it's certainly an ongoing process, and I think it's something that's here to stay. With the increasing variability of climatic conditions and things that we can't control, I think farmers are looking to take back a bit of control and actually do things in a different way, rather than be reliant on perhaps techniques they've done in the past and traditional weather patterns. Things are changing, and I think we have to adapt to that change as farmers and advisors as well.
Yeah. A subject that we touched on when we spoke before today was about our contribution, our responsibility towards food security and producing food, for the public. How does regen farming as a technique help us in that aim? Tom, maybe you could start with that challenging question.
Well, thank you, Tony. I mean, it's actually not challenging at all, because regen farming is resilient farming, and we're facing, increasingly erratic weather systems, big weather events and some kind of big swings and periods of drought, wet and hot and cold. But actually, when we're protecting our soils when we're incorporating those regenerative principles, actually our farming is our soil's more resilient, our crops are more resilient, and actually we're more resilient as well. So there's a lot more thought that goes into it, but it enables us to respond to what's in front of us. And farming is absolutely a longer term game. We need to make profit in the year that we're in, but actually it's a multi-annual game, and we can kind of think and plan forward when our crops are more resilient, rather than following the peaks and troughs of the market and our crazy current weather system.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And Ian, would you add anything to Tom's thoughts there?
Yeah, I think Tom is totally right. If I was to start with the first process is a mindset. The second process is understanding your soils and making sure that you've got your soil structure and drainage in as good a condition as you can attain. And then I think there are opportunities to change your system, to look at how you can reduce cultivations or actually remove cultivations. We can go around the houses and look at different drills forever and a day. You find a drill that suits your system, and something that can actually operate in a range of conditions.
Ian, if I can just pick up on that, I think you're absolutely right. I think mindset is the first barrier to overcome, and the big watch out for me is always the phrase, well, that wouldn't work on my farm. And actually, if we can make that, how could that work on my farm? That's the key to kind of unlocking the first step on that regenerative journey.
Let's bring all of this together, because we could talk about this for hours, and I'm sure that is exactly what's happening around the country. So the question is, what top tip would you like to share with listeners today in terms of regen agriculture and the key benefit and reason to change? Let's start with you, Ian, and we're looking for this top tip. So this is going to be interesting.
I think the most important top tip, apart from attitude and a will to make something, to look at something, I think maintenance of good soil structure is the most critical for soil resilience and output going forward. And I think that's appropriate for whatever level or whatever your system is that you're operating. And the second one is trying to build soil organic matter.
Great, thank you, Ian. And John, from your perspective?
Yeah, Tony, I think it's being brave enough to try something new, taking on board what Ian has said, and then actually stepping outside of perhaps where we have once been and the blueprint that we've perhaps been used to. So being brave enough to try something new for the first time, and then use your attention to detail to follow that through and monitor what you can learn from that.
Thank you, John. Great top tips. And Tom, what would be your top tips for listeners today?
Well, I'd underline absolutely what Ian and John have said. It's important that our businesses are viable. So we don't want to be betting the farm. We've got to be prepared to have a certain level of risk in terms of the kind of agronomy side of things, in terms of the farm practices. But I think it's to take greater risk in terms of our thinking, to take those kind of intellectual, mental risks, to be prepared to think, how could this work, and what could happen in my system. And we do a lot of work on our farm with children and young people, and I'm often asked what makes, what are the characteristics of a great farmer, and I always respond the same, and that is curiosity is so important. Why doesn't this work? Why did this work? Why didn't it work? And how could we change things next year? So to be curious, to take those risks in terms of how we think about our system and how we are open to change.
Thank you, Ian, John and Tom, for sharing your insights and ideas today as to how regen can have a very significant impact on your farms. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions you'd like us to ask the experts, email info@agri.co.uk. See you next time.